How's everybody doing? Great to be learning with you on a Thursday, Yom Hamishi. Let's light up the darkness. Who's in the house? Steven in New Hampshire, Yehuda in South Carolina, Guy in Ohio, Shandor in the Bronx, Randy in Florida, Bill in Missouri, Paul in the Great Northwest, Bella in Florida, Lorraine in Texas, Paul in the Great Northwest, Melissa in Great Neck, Joe in the Inland Empire, Tom in PA, Jonathan in Ventura County, Sharon in New Jersey, Karen in Northern California, Marjorie in Georgia, Chaim in Florida, Ella, Ifa in Florida. Our learning today is dedicated in memory of Sarah Bas Avraham Aryeh. May her neshama have a great aliyah. This is a good friend of mine's mom, and he's in Shiva right now, and I'm going to a minyan there right after this class. And so we're going to have to keep it moving today so that I can have a chance of getting there on time. So a quick Elul shofar blast, and then let's get to it. Getting better, getting closer. Our daf is page 82 here in Tractate Bava Basra, the 23rd volume of the Talmud. Working our way through chapter 5 today, continuing our discussion of Mishnah number 6. We pick this up right at the top of page 82a. The Mishnah taught, with regard to one who buys 2 trees in the field of another, if the trees grew, the owner of the field may not cut down their branches. The Mishnah further teaches that which grows out of the trunk belongs to the owner of the tree, but that which grows out of the roots belongs to the owner of the ground. Now, the key distinction in our Mishnah was that if you buy 2 trees in the field of another person, so what you bought is trees, just the trees. You didn't get the land under the trees. You're gonna have a right to access the trees, to walk through the guy's field in order to get to your trees so that you can harvest their fruit. And because he sold you the trees, that which grows out of the trunks, right, the produce that comes out of the branches that come out of the trunk, that belongs to the owner of the tree. But the roots, which can spread out and even go a long distance, what comes out of them, that belongs to the owner of the field. Since the guy who bought the trees didn't buy land, he only bought the trees, once those trees die, he can't replant new trees in their place. He only bought those trees, not the spot, as it were, where the trees grow. By contrast, if he bought 3 trees that make a triangle, so then what he buys is the land of that triangle. And therefore, if the trees fall down or die, he can replant trees in that triangle. He can plant other things within that triangle. But if his branches extend beyond that piece of land, okay, so now they're growing onto somebody else's land, not your own. So it's going to have a different outcome, but it's not so simple. So let's keep reading. Right, so with regard to one who buys 2 trees in the field of another, if the trees grew, the owner of the field, the one who kept the seller, right, the owner of the field around the trees, he may not cut down their branches. The branches belong to the owner of the trees. And the Mishnah further teaches that which grows out of the trunk belongs to the owner of the tree. But that which grows out of the roots belongs to the owner of the ground. And the Gemara asked, what are the circumstances in which something is considered to be growing out of the trunk? And what are the circumstances in which it is considered to be growing out of the roots? And Rabbi Yochanan said, with regard to anything that sees the face of the sun, i.e., which is visible and above ground, this is considered to be growing out of the trunk. And with regard to that which does not see the face of the sun, but is concealed in the earth, this is considered to be growing out of the roots. And the Gemara asks, but if everything that is visible that sees the sun belongs to the owner of the tree, no matter how close it is to the ground, well, then let us be concerned that perhaps the land will be covered with sediment from flowing water. And suddenly the level of the dirt, the ground level as it were, is higher than it was at the time when the tree was sold. Why would that matter? Because then a low branch emerging from that trunk, which then curves up a few feet away from the tree, will look like a separate tree. And now this guy who bought 2 trees, we're going to say actually he bought 3 trees. And if he bought 3 trees, well, then he gets the land along with it. Totally different deal. So this idea that anything that sees the face of the sun, well, what if the ground level changes and what was previously a branch now looks like a separate tree, a separate shoot? All right? Let us be concerned that perhaps the land is covered with sediment from flowing water and some of the tree's trunk will be covered, in which case the branches that grow from the trunk will appear as though they are separate trees. And the owner of the trees will say to the owner of the field, you actually sold me 3 trees, and therefore I have ownership over the ground between them. Rather, Rav Nachman said that which grows from the trunk belongs to the owner of the tree, but he must cut it down. And Rabbi Yochanan himself likewise said the owner of the tree must cut it down. Those branches that emerge from the trunk, where they're low down, and this could happen, that situation could happen, they do belong to the owner of the tree, but he has to cut them down to prevent that situation from formulating. Rav Nachman said, we hold by tradition that a palm tree bought from another has no trunk. Has no trunk? What do you mean a palm tree has no trunk? Rav Zevit thought to say this means that the owner of the palm tree has no right to that which grows from the trunk. And the reason is that since it stands ready to be dug up and uprooted, as when the tree dies, its owner is not entitled to plant another in its place, he diverts his mind from that which grows from the trunk. In other words, what's a palm tree? A palm tree is only trunk and what's at the top. Right? At the top is where the leaves emerge, and it's as those leaves fall away that the trunk gets extended. It doesn't put out branches like a deciduous tree would. Is that the right term here? Like other kinds of trees would. Right? So palm tree is only trunk, and when a palm tree dies, it doesn't regenerate. So what they're saying is there's no trunk for branches to grow out of, and once it dies, in a situation where he only bought 2 trees, that palm tree is just going to get cut down. It's going to get uprooted by the owner of the field, and the owner of the purchaser of the tree understands that at the time that he buys the tree. What is he buying? He's buying the remaining years of productivity, let's say of a date palm, that he can harvest dates from it until the tree dies. And once it dies, there's no value in that trunk the way there would be in a sycamore, for example. Okay. Rav Papa objects to this, but this is comparable to one who buys 2 trees in a field belonging to another, as the trees stand ready to be dug up and uprooted because the owner has no right to plant new trees in their place after they die. And yet, it is taught in the Mishna that he has the right to that which grows from the trunk. Stuff grows from the trunk of those other kinds of trees. So rather, Rav Papa said, this statement of Rav Nachman means that the owner of a palm tree, in contrast to owners of other types of trees, has no right to that which grows from the trunk, since a palm does not produce branches from its trunk. The Gemara asks, but according to the opinion of Rav Zevid, who maintains that Rav Nachman is referring to all types of trees, so then the Mishnah is difficult. And the Gemara answers, Rav Zevid interprets the Mishnah as referring to a situation where the owner of the trees bought the trees for 5 years and stipulated that he may plant new trees in place of the original trees in the event the original ones are cut down. So as always, we come back to these guys could have agreed to any terms that they want at the time that they negotiated the purchase and sale. It's only in the absence of specific terms that we're saying, well, what was bought when they simply orally agreed, I'm selling you 2 trees or I'm selling you 3 trees in my field, then what goes with it. in terms of can I replant in that spot, can I not, can I harvest, how much room around the tree for harvesting, etc. They could have agreed to terms, and that would have been all right. It's in the absence of that kind of negotiation that a court may have to step in and make an interpretation. The Mishnah teaches if one bought 3 trees, he has acquired the ground along with them, right? That triangle of ground among the 3 trees. And the Gemara asks, and how much of the field does he acquire? So Rabbi Chia bar Abba says that Rabbi Yochanan says this buyer has acquired the ground that is located underneath the trees and the area between them. And with regard to the space outside of the trees and their branches, he has acquired an area sufficient for a gatherer of figs and his basket in hand to stand close to the tree. Now we're on page 82b, right? So he gets some ground, and how far outside of the triangle formed by the trunks does this extend? Enough so that his harvester can come and get at the fruit of the trees. You can't get at all of the fruit from right underneath the tree. You might have to stand a little bit outside the tree with your pole and the hook and the basket, etc. And so that much land, what's needed to harvest the produce of that tree, that's how much land he gets along with his 3 trees. Now, Rabbi Elazar objects to this. Now that the law is that he has no path, and he must purchase a path through the field to access his trees, if so, does he have possession of an area for the gatherer and his basket? And the Gemara elaborates, he has no path, even though he has no other means of gaining access to the trees, as the ground that he acquired along with the trees is considered another land and is not part of the rest of the field. Why then would he have possession of an area for a gatherer and his basket, right? So interesting, if you purchase 2 trees, you don't get land with it, but you automatically get access, a path across the field that you can use. You don't own it, but you can use it to get to your trees. If you buy 3 trees, so now you get like a mini field, right? That triangle of ground that goes with the trees. You get that as your land. But you don't get an easement. You don't get an automatic path through the field to reach it. You and the seller are going to, the purchaser of the trees and the seller of the trees are going to have to agree on what is the rental or the access or the cost of that path. You don't automatically get a path when you buy 3 trees because you do automatically get the land between the trees. Rabbi Zera says, from this statement, i.e. the objection of our teacher, we learn that it is in the case of 3 trees that the owner of the trees has no path, as the buyer acquired a separate piece of land along with the trees. But in the case of 2 trees, the buyer has a path. As he says to the owner of the field, my trees are standing on your land. And as I am allowed to use your field to tend my trees, I have the right to walk through your land to reach them. As opposed to when you have 3 trees, so then you're standing on your own land that came with the trees in order to tend to them, so you don't get an automatic access to the path. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak said to Rava, shall we say that Rabbi Elazar does not accept the opinion of Shmuel, who was his teacher? As Shmuel says, the law is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, who says, one who sells generously. So according to Rabbi Akiva, one who sells in a manner that is advantageous for the buyer and is presumed to have included in the sale even items that were not explicitly specified. So in this case, as he has sold a tree that remains on his property, the seller grants the buyer the right to access his tree. Rava said to him, even if Rabbi Elazar himself agrees with Rabbi Akiva, the Mishnah cannot be explained in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, that one who sells generously. Rather, the Mishnah must be in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis, who hold that one who sells does so sparingly. And the difficulty that Rabbi Elazar raised against Rabbi Yochanan is predicated on the fact that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of the rabbis. From where does Rava derive that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva? From the fact that the Mishnah teaches if the 3 trees grew, the owner of the land may cut down the branches that extend into his field, away from the little plot of land that the owner of the trees purchased, and into the land that retained by the owner of the field. So since branches are growing from somebody else's land onto his land, he has the right to cut down those branches. And if it enters your mind that the Mishnah is in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, why may he cut them down? Doesn't Rabbi Akiva say that one who sells generously? Meaning that it's enough land, along with the trees goes enough room for the trees to grow. So Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak said to him, this does not prove that the Mishnah is not in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva. You can say that Rabbi Akiva stated his ruling in the case of a pit and a cistern that are situated in a field belonging to another, which one sells in a generous manner, as they do not weaken the land. And so you get the path along with it. But did you hear him say that the seller is generous toward the buyer with regard to a tree, which can weaken the land? Because if it spreads out a lot, it's going to cast shade on the field and reduce the available area where he could grow crops. Doesn't Rabbi Akiva concede in the case of a tree that leans out into the field of another, in which the owner of the field cuts down the branches until the full height of an ox goad, that the handle that protrudes, the full height of an ox goad, meaning the handle that protrudes over a plow. Since the extending branches impede his efforts to plow his field, it is permitted for him to cut them down. And this indicates that even according to Rabbi Akiva, one does not grant privileges that are detrimental to his own interests. If so, the Mishnah can be explained even in accordance with the opinion of Rabbi Akiva, which indicates that Rabbi Elazar does not accept his ruling. And the Gemara points out it is taught in a baraisa in accordance with the statement of Rabbi Chia bar Abba. If one buys 3 trees in a field belonging to another, this buyer has acquired the ground the ground that is found underneath the trees and the area between them, and outside of the trees and their branches, an area sufficient for a gatherer of figs and his basket. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, those areas around the trees that are designated for a gatherer of figs and his basket are used for this purpose only at specific times. Who sows that land during the rest of the year? The owner of the trees or the owner of the field? Right? Great question. The area that you need under the trees and even a little outboard of that triangle of trees so that the gatherer can come along and take his figs and basket with his basket, etc. Well, he's only doing that at the time that fruit is ready to be harvested. Maybe that's only once a year. I mean, figs is a little different because they produce fruit during much of the year. But if we're talking about apple trees that maybe only produce one harvest a year, or oranges or something, somebody can tell me what's a fruit that's only once a year. So the rest of the year, just so that he has that access, the owner of the field cannot grow any produce in that space? Is that what we're saying? So that's what Abaye is asking. And Rav Yosef, who's Abaye's teacher, said to him, you learn the answer in a Mishnah on page 99b, that we'll get to in 17 days. If one owns a garden that is surrounded by the garden of another person, the owner of the inner garden has a right to a path through the outer garden. Even so, the owner of the outer garden may sow the path. The guy can walk through, but you can also plant where that path is. And Abaye said to him, are these cases comparable? There, in the case of the outer and inner gardens, there is no loss suffered by the buyer when the owner of the outer garden sows the path, as he can still pass through it. But here, there is a loss for the buyer of the trees, as the one who bought the trees says to the owner of the field, the fruits that fall from the trees will become soiled by the plants. I might have thought that they protect the fruits from becoming soiled by the ground. But if you think about it, we're not just talking about like a nice layer of grass. We're talking about, all kinds of croppage that could be there, and the fruit could get lost around the bases, etc. Now, this case is similar only to the last clause of that Mishnah, which states, if the owner of the inner garden is given a side path, so that he suffers a loss of some kind because he cannot take the shortest path to reach his garden, both this owner of the inner garden and that owner of the outer garden are not permitted to sow that path. And similarly here too, neither the owner of the trees nor the owner of the field are permitted to sow the place designated for the gatherer of fruit from those trees. The Gemara comments, it is taught in a Baraisa in accordance with the opinion of Abaye. The buyer has acquired the ground that is found underneath the trees and the area between them and outside of the trees and their branches. How much? An area sufficient for a gatherer of figs and his basket. And both this owner of the field and that owner of the trees are not permitted to sow crops in that area. And the Gemara inquires, and how much space must there be? And by the way, I'm almost done. Questions or comments, please get them in now. And how much space must there be between the three trees for them to be considered one unit? Which means that the land is acquired by the owner of the trees. And Rav Yosef says, that Rav Yehuda says, that Shmuel says, the distance between the trees must be from 4 to 8 cubits. Rava says that Rav Nachman says that Shmuel says it must be from 8 cubits to 16 cubits. Because obviously, if it was a big distance, 100 cubits, I mean, that's a big triangle, right? If the trees are 100 cubits apart, and they're going to get all the land in the triangle among them, that's a huge part of the field that's been given away. So we're only saying that you get the land along with the 3 trees if the 3 trees are relatively close together. How close is that? So according to one opinion, from 4 to 8 cubits. According to the other opinion, from 8 to 16 cubits. Abaye said to Rav Yosef, do not disagree with Rav Nachman, as we learned in the Mishna, in accordance with his opinion. As we learned in the Mishna, Tractate Kilayim, one who plants his vineyard 16 cubits by 16 cubits, i.e., he leaves 16 cubits between each row of vines, he is permitted to bring other species of seeds to the empty spaces between the rows and sow them there, and he won't be violating the law against planting diverse kinds of crops among the vineyard. And this is not considered a violation of the biblical prohibition with regard to sowing diverse crops in the vineyard, which is one of the prohibitions of diverse kinds. So that's considered a significant distance. So I guess that's going to be the maximum, is what's called a significant distance. Beyond that, it's unnecessary for the trees to go with the land. We'll stop there. Let me take a few questions, and then I'll rush off to the Shiva. Sharon, if the fruit of a tree comes down onto the ground and its seeds result in a new tree, to whom does that tree belong? Sounds like if it comes from the ground and it was a case where the purchaser bought 2 trees, so he doesn't own the ground, so even though the seed came from his tree, now it's coming from the ground, and that would belong to the owner of the field. If he bought 3 trees and the seed takes root within that triangle, then it belongs to him. Jonathan, if you bought 2 trees and got an easement, and then later you add a 3rd tree, is it counted as buying 3 or buying 2 plus 1? And what happened to the easement that you did have? So it's so interesting. I think what you're saying is you bought 2, right, from the owner of the field. Okay, so you got a path, you didn't get the land. Later, you bought a 3rd tree. Does that count, since in the end you bought 3 trees from the owner of the field, that you get the triangle? Or do they have to be purchased at the same time? Perfect Talmudic question. I don't know the answer. Hopefully we'll find out soon. Joe, how much of a drip line is allowed for a tree? We are in the weeds now. I don't know, but I guess what you're saying is, does he have access not just to walk through the field, but to bring water through the field? Fantastic question. I don't know the answer. I'm going to guess that in the absence of a negotiation, I would doubt that you can bring a new water source. You can't dig a ditch, through that field to bring water. But if there already was a little ditch, a little canal bringing water to those trees, and you bought 2 trees, and then later the guy in the field wants to plant something where that ditch is going to be inconvenient to him, does he have to leave the ditch in place because your trees depend on it? Probably, but this is a great question and I don't know the answer. I hope we'll find out. Sharon, what about other maintenance of the tree besides harvesting? Sounds like you get that, right? You get that. Because I would think that for the harvesters to receive the fruit is the same kind of idea as what you need to access that tree so that it can produce. And probably the area is very similar, right? What you need to do maintenance and what you need to receive the fruit and reach up, to high branches, probably about the same area. And Jonathan, final question. Sorry for all the questions about trees, but what if the tree is the fruit? Like cinnamon. So how would that change it? Are you saying that the space needed to access higher branches, and like if you then need less space in order to get at the tree, so maybe for that reason you would get a little bit less space, but otherwise it sounds to me like it should produce a pretty similar result. That's what I've got for us today. Excited to be learning with you again tomorrow, Friday, regular Friday time, noon Pacific. Have a great night.